I'd like to say a few words about all of this Chopin because I've spent a lot of time and a lot of love um, playing Chopin. And I became enamored with Chopin because he was somebody who, like a piano nerd, spent so much time at the piano, devoted so many hours of love and inspiration, and spent a lot of time teaching people. He was a very shy person about performing, and so in some way I saw myself being similar to him, of course, on a much lower level. Uh, One of the things that I just loved identifying with was his love of nature, his ability to kind of go into a trance. And his music is full of these places that I guess you could say they go out to lunch, or they're so inspired. It's either he goes into his zone, and when he's in his zone, there's just nobody like Chopin. Nobody handles the piano quite the way he does, and partly it's because he devoted his whole life to that instrument, to one instrument. What I like personally about playing Chopin in particular, and everything that I've said, is there's this sense of complete freedom if you can kind of identify with his magic. And so it kind of fits, Chopin fits in very well to my themes in life. So I thought I'd just take a few moments to talk about the main threads of my life that have really inspired me. My life has always been in music, I should say. My life in music has been motion and emotion, and that's the idea of being able to play the piano with minimum effort and a lot of ease for maximum effect and expression and emotion. I got this idea early on when I was a ballet dancer, that it would be just lovely to be able to float. And when I play the piano, I mean, I've spent quite a bit of time figuring out the best way for me to play the piano, and that has no physical strain to it whatsoever. So I do feel like I'm floating, and I slide around and float above the keys. And it takes me into this special space, which I think is very helpful. And again, what it does, this idea of motion and emotion, which I've spent a lot of time teaching various students all over the world, is it gives you this ability to not be limited technically, so that you can really be as close to 100% free to express yourself. And it also helps this idea of being able to just have your own identity come forward, because you don't have restrictions. So, Chopin felt like each finger could make many, many colors and different expressions. And so I really buy into that, because I think that everybody has a fingerprint, and everybody has a fingerprint in sound. And really, sound is the emotion of music. And so it is very, very important to have, to be able to have your own voice and to be able to express your fingerprint. It's like painting. It's like painting. And I think playing the piano for me is like fingerprinting, and finger painting or fingerprinting, or in that sense, it's full of color and full of nuance and full of freedom and fantasy. I wanted to say also just one sentence or two about my piano, which is an 1891 Steinway that's rebuilt. And it's not rebuilt like the current Steinways. It has a little bit of a historical sound to it, in terms of clarity, in terms of color, in terms of lack of lacquered hammers. The soft pedal has more ability to do more things, like reminiscent of the moderator pedal. And this piano is sort of very dear to my heart. And I love it because it has so much color and so much nuance. And so I'm somebody that is bonded with my own piano. You know, it's like a living thing to me. So I wanted to mention that. I think it's very important for everybody to eventually find a forever piano. I mean, it's just a lovely, lovely feeling. A fair amount of Chopin's writing is reminiscent of water sounds and ocean sounds. And so, for instance, a good example of that would be the slow movement of the B minor sonata, which has this feeling of calm water movement. And it's also very interesting because in that whole section, it's a great example of where he uses right pedal, and he also uses finger pedal. And if you put those two together and you really, really can master that, it's just wonderful colors and wonderful nuance. And I've thought many times about the fact that if he had lived longer, or if he were alive today, what kind of music he would be writing, because, you know, his romanticism crosses into impressionism in so many ways, and it is so transcendent. To me, anyway, it's so transcendent, and I love it. Of course, Chopin, like all great composers, is a master of contrast, and his mood swings are very definite and by and large very well planned. He always has form in mind, and yet some of his suddenness of expression are just really dramatic and really emphatic, and are really shocking, and I think that's great. So he wanders between different moods, and you know, it's amazing that his whole world is the piano. And if you go through all of the review the performance practices of his time, which, for instance, like one piece blends into the next, which is something that I love to do, so that the resonance from one piece carries into the next. I mean, that was partly what was done at the time, and you can see that if you let the piano ring in the same key from one piece to another, it sounds just so gorgeous. And at the same time, if that doesn't work, you can modulate your way into that, and we do have souvenirs from that past. So the whole idea was to just step into this alternate universe and stay there maybe for an hour or an hour and a half or whatever. And in my imagination, I think of Chopin spending an afternoon there. Well, much the way on my own level that I go to my wonderful, beautiful piano that I love so much, and I spend an hour over there, and my piano even has a name. His name is Ferrari, and it's a he. Before I conclude these few comments, you know, I just wanted to say a little bit about my life on Earth, which is part performer, part teacher, and now sort of the founder and director of RPPF and RPPF Mini. And I'm really concerned to help people find their voice, to help them make a transition from student to teacher, to promote legacy, not only in myself, but in everybody, all my colleagues and friends all over the world, to see composers as painters, and just to further the oral history of sound. And one point that's very important is that all of these composers, you know, whether you're talking about Beethoven or Liszt or Mendelssohn or whoever, Bartok, they were all in love with sound. And there is no teacher that doesn't talk about sound. I mean, that is the one unifying thing about music. It's that sound is the carrier of emotion. And there's limitless beauty and limitless variety. And that's a very, very healing agent for everybody all over the world. And I hope it will stay that way forever. One thing that I could say is that, when you perform, one of the most important things to learn how to do, and sometimes you do it naturally, and sometimes you need some coaching, is to go to that place. Everybody finds that place in a different way, but you kind of go into this place where you transport yourself to another dimension. And of course, it's obvious that the great geniuses of our time, whether they were artists or writers, painters, performers, whatever, they're different amounts, and people do it in different ways. I mean, I love to think of Chihuly because his creative force is just so powerful, or Picasso, for instance. And I think of Chopin, who is so able to go to find that place and be there so often. And it's like doing yoga or meditation. I mean, if one does yoga every day, then one's going to feel better, and you look forward to that, and it's uplifting. So I feel, again, that music is a very, very special force, not only for me, but for everybody. And I love peanut butter, and I love spreading that force of music around, because I feel it's very, very beneficial to all of us. We'll all live longer and be happier and have more peace. I think that gardening would be more like teaching, where you plant a seed and you watch it grow. Sometimes you plant a seed and you're surprised it doesn't come up for maybe 2 weeks. Sometimes it comes up a month later. I've had students where I've planted various seeds and then I see them 5 years later and I think, wow, that seed did come up and I thought it would never come up. And I hear from students about that. So that's a really, really nice thing, because, when you teach, things stick right away, and sometimes they don't stick right away. And I can give you examples from my own life of how I got an aha experience from a teacher 25 years after the fact, because it just kind of went boop, and there it was. So, sharing knowledge is very, very important. This particular DVD that I have made shows at least my understanding of using some historical ornamentation and improvisation, because that was the style then. And I think it's so important to have an understanding of how historical instruments sounded, whether it's Pleyel or Erard in Chopin's time, because that's where their consciousness was, and also to try and reach in and do some of the ornamentation and improvisation that was taken for granted at that time, because that makes you closer to the composer, and it actually makes you smarter, because you're sort of aligning yourself in a more historical way, and then you can go more into the present and maybe do something different. So again, that's the kind of teacher part, speaking, and I think that's very, very important to impart to students before they go off and make their own interpretation, because your own interpretation has to have a foundation.